Very good. So, Ilan Stavans, I'll let you do your introduction on Octavio Paz, which I find a fascinating, not just poet, philosopher, whatever you want to call him. And then everybody's invited to post questions, and I have my own questions. I've been a fan of Octavio Paz. I'm a scientist, but I've been a fan of Octavio Paz poetry since I was, I don't know, a teenager. All yours.
Thank you, Yero. Thank you, the organization of Laser, Stanford University, for this invitation. We are all born alone in solitude. We live in solitude, and we depart this world in solitude. It is the one condition we are unable to shake away. It is the one that defines us. However, it is not a jail. It is not a doom as a result of that solitude. It is the challenge that we have to understand the condition of that solitude that will make us capable of engaging with others, of understanding our own capacities, and ultimately of leaving a mark on the world into which we arrived and from which we depart. Octavio Paz believed thoroughly that solitude was that irreplaceable and constant in being human, and spent his entire life, born in 1914, dead in 1998, writing about that solitude from a variety of perspectives. He was born in Mexico and died in Mexico, though he can literally be described as a man of the 20th century and of the world entire. He was the child and grandchild of family members that have fought in the Mexican Revolution that started in 1910, the very first labor movement to shake the 20th century, even before the Bolshevik Revolution. In his youth, traveled throughout Mexico to understand the native landscape that had given him a stage in which he could thrive. And eventually, as a result of serendipity, but mostly of intellectual curiosity, traveled the world as far as India, where he was a cultural attaché and later held other responsibilities, lived in Paris, held a Guggenheim Fellowship in Los Angeles, and lived in other parts of the United States, visited Argentina, and spent generous time during the Spanish Civil War in the Iberian Peninsula, where he coincided with other Latin American poets like Pablo Neruda and Cesar Vallejo, the first one from Chile and the second one from Peru. There is the adjective that is often connected to, or the noun, depending on how we use it, to Paz, and that is that he was a polymath. Others describe him as a Renaissance man. Either way, both attest to the insatiable hunger that he had for knowledge. He seems to be, from the very childhood that he had in Mexico City to the adult advanced age in his 80s, also in Mexico City, always engaging in two acts, or maybe arts. One is the act of reading as much as he could in as many languages as was possible. He mastered, obviously, and became a distinguished practitioner of the Spanish language, but was fluent in French, was versatile in English, and could also understand other languages, including languages from India. And the other activity that he had is that of writing. Given the complete works that Octavio Paz produced, close to 20 volumes of mammoth size that cover an astonishingly broad range of topics. One could easily and not facetiously say that the man was either reading or writing even at moments where he wasn't awake. And maybe thinking of those moments when he wasn't awake, one should invoke the fact that in his adolescence, he was dramatically defined by the literary and aesthetic movement of surrealism, having spent some time, particularly in Paris, and being influenced by André Breton, Tristan Tzara, and others, to appreciate the fact that we can be alone with ourselves, but also free at two dimensions: the dimension of the mind and the body, and the dimension of the dreams. And as such, he was always enamored and curious about this grammar and syntax of dreams. He writes in poetic form and in essayistic form about those dreams regularly. And maybe one could add to the fact that if those two activities, writing and reading, are constant, persistent, and even obsessive, that in his sleep, if not reading and writing directly, it is about reading and about writing that he also seems to be engaged in. If I wanted, and I have to say I am a devotee of Paz. He could have been the age of my grandfather. I am Mexican myself, and I feel an enormous debt as a Spanish-speaking writer, as a thinker, as a poet, and mostly as a Mexican, to his legacy, inserting Mexico in the current of the 20th century, that one could divide his work into two sides. Paz, which, by the way, in Spanish means peace, the poet. And it is mostly as a poet that he became widely known throughout the Spanish-speaking world. And many of the prizes, from the Cervantes Prize to the Nobel Prize, constantly commend his poetic capacity. And the other side is his essayistic drive. Paz seemed to have written essays about all kinds of topics of various lengths. Some of them can be extraordinarily short, 2 or 3 paragraphs long. Others can go for long pages and take the form of a monograph or a biography, or even a lengthy history of Mexico, or a comparative analysis of the religions and cultures of India and pre-Columbian and Catholic religious influences in Mexico. And if one sees those two sides, the poetic and the essayistic, one could perhaps come close to appreciating the two minds, or the two hearts, that Paz has. One is to summarize and describe the world in impressionistic ways through the sounds, through the echoes, through the reverberations of words. The range of his vocabulary is enormous. His poetic pen moves swiftly and at its own tempo in describing the pre-Columbian past, the challenges of Mexico living as a modern country, and the encounters that he himself has with others in Mexico, with others in the world, but mostly with his own solitude, trying to break away and into deeper that solitude. His poetry encompasses numerous works from very early on, mostly short poems that invoke the Nahuatl/Aztec, as well as the Mayan Quiché past, one of central Mexico and the other one of southern Mexico, the Yucatan Peninsula and Central America. And the other is the critical mind, critical analytical mind that he uses in his essays. None of his essays, and to me, his essays, some of them are just nothing short of masterpieces, attempts to describe whatever topic is before him in an engaging, fluid, non-academic, and very poetic way, in order to make the intellectual mind and the poetic voice that he has not isolated in the realm of an academic environment, which he felt allergic to, even though he spent time at Princeton and at Harvard and at Stanford and in other universities, but to speak to the larger audience without being condescending, engaging with the public in general by informing and educating it, but also offering surrealistic, at times always impressionistic views of how he understood history, current politics, never shying away from offering ideological statements that would provoke and even destabilize the audience that he had. A couple of crucial moments in that engagement of the critical / poetic mind is in 1968, when Mexico, after a long period of a one-party dictatorship, finally mobilizes students, housewives, workers, take to the streets and claim and argue and propose for a different type of government, bringing down the ruling or attempting to bring down the ruling party, the Partido Revolucionario Institucional, the Institutional Revolutionary Party. At that point, Octavio Paz finds himself in India, in Paris, and writes openly against the government that is sponsoring some of the positions in diplomacy that he has, which pushed him to resign those positions and sympathize with the opposing side that is trying to make Mexico more pluralistic, democratic, and equal. Conversely, more toward the end of his life, he won the Nobel Prize in 1990. Paz is seen by many young people in Mexico as a member of the status quo of the government. He has become comfortable with the president, various presidents of that same ruling party, Partido Revolucionario Institucional. He becomes also cozy with the main television station, a network, Televisa, that never stopped celebrating him as the modern icon of Mexico. And the very descendants of those rebellious student voices of the 60s now become anti-Octavio Paz voices who think of him as a grammatical ogre. This is the term that he used as a title, el ogro gramático, in one of his books, and now has been adopted as a description of him as distant, disconnected with the democratic spirit of Mexico. I think it's very important to keep in mind that the intellectual and political odyssey that Octavio Paz is one first of dissidence, and eventually into a consent and even endorsement of the policies that in older age will make him a veteran and a spokesperson of the ruling party. Myself included at that time in 1990, and from 1990, the Nobel Prize moment where people say the monster has received the prize up until 98 when he dies, is one of rejection and one of a cautious admiration, because the very tenets that he had prayed when younger have now become passé, and now he is a commodity of the status quo. I want to speak particularly about two books of Octavio Paz in the time that I have remaining, that after his death, after the dust has settled, remain to me nothing short of extraordinary. The first one is called The Labyrinth of Solitude. Um, Arguably is Octavio Paz's most famous and lasting book. It was published in a series of essays in various magazines and collected into a book in 1950, eventually close to the 1960s. It was translated into English also with the same title, but in English, The Labyrinth of Solitude, El Laberinto de la Soledad. And this is a study, a a cultural study, very much in the spirit of a psychoanalytic drive that was taking place in the 1940s of using Freud and psychoanalysis in order to understand not only the individual psyche, but the sociological archetypal patterns of entire nations as if they were individuals with a superego and an id, that Paz delves into trying to understand what makes Mexico and Mexicans unique. And where he touches that very core of his thought, the idea of solitude as the essence that needs to be analyzed and dissected. He says that there is no such thing as human solitude in general as a universal paradigm, but instead every culture has a different understanding of solitude. And especially he distinguishes between Americans being living in solitude, meaning North Americans, and Mexicans, also Americans, but of Latin America, of a Latin American connection, experiencing solitude in a very different way. He says, whereas North Americans get drunk, for instance, in order to fight away their feeling of being alone. Mexicans get drunk in order to escape their feeling of being in solitude, not only in the present time, but in history, and that the passage of history in Mexico from the pre-colonial period to the present is an opportunity to see how solitude mutates over time, how it gets transformed, but never ultimately it could not be shaken away for good. Octavio Paz, I should say, it's only one of the many Latin American writers that roughly in the middle of the 20th century, but in the second half of the 20th century, become almost obsessed with the concept of solitude. Another one that you might recognize is Gabriel Garcia Marquez with 100 Years of Solitude, a novel that is described as the most important book written in the Spanish language after Don Quixote in about 400 years, 450 years distance from one another. And it is the story of a family and of a town and of a continent that live in solitude. Octavio Paz doesn't write novels, doesn't write fiction, doesn't write about an entire continent, but he writes about the solitude of the Mexican with themselves, with their own demons, in their own condition. And the second book that I want to bring forth is a biography that Octavio Paz writes in the 1970s and publishes at the beginning of the 1980s, 81, depending on the edition in Mexico or in Spain, 1982. And it's about the other best Mexican poet ever to be produced by that wonderful country. And in this case, it's a female poet, Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, a nun who lived in the 17th century in a convent in Mexico City and produced some of the most distinguished and lasting sonnets and epistemological poems of the Spanish language then and now, and is today seen as a proto-feminist who fought for the role of women, even though she was trapped in a convent, and used knowledge like Paz to explore the condition of the relationship between the encounter of the Aztecs and the Spaniards that produced a mestizo culture of which she herself and Octavio Paz were immediate descendants. Octavio Paz became fascinated by Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz and writes a biography called Sor Juana or the Traps of Faith, where he explores the condition of women in the 17th century, and he talks about the role of the Catholic Church in suppressing the Aztec and other indigenous religious structures, supplanting them and creating a culture within that culture that is syncretic and that is the result of transculturation. And Paz produces a biography that is really a model of how to explore the mind and the life pattern of an individual. It is anything but scholarly and yet astonishingly intellectual. It is written in a poetic voice that is accessible to everybody, even though it is a very demanding nature. And it shows also that a biographer needs to subsume himself or herself into the life of the biography in a way that is both objective and impartial and absolutely subjective and partial. Paz strikes this middle ground by analyzing the poems of Sor Juana from his very own perspective, and even declaring that those poems are stepping stones to reach the position that he has arrived as a poet in the 20th century, a descendant of Sor Juana. And he does it in a prose style that is enchanting, is hypnotic, it's absolutely rigorous, and that creates a model in a continent, Latin America, where writing biographies up until that time, the early 80s, was not seen as an intellectual or editorial exercise worth embarking on. Let me wrap up this very brief, very impressionistic introduction by offering to you my own experience as a reader of Paz. I first discovered him in my late teens in Mexico through his poetry, enchanted by the capacity to articulate that tension between the external and the internal worlds in which he lives, and by attempting to create a philosophy of mestizaje, of the mestizo, that is the crossbreed between the European Spanish legacy and the pre-Columbian, mostly Aztec and Mayan legacy, in a way that doesn't use easy academic categories like post-colonial or post-structural, although he understood them quite well and digested them just as many of his generation had done too. And the discovery of that poetry led me to find a copy of The Labyrinth of Solitude. I read it maybe when I was 19. I was never the same. I understood what my Mexicanness was all about. Maybe I have been in dialogue with El Laberinto de la Soledad ever since. I wrote myself a book called The Hispanic Condition in the early 90s that in many ways is a tribute to El Laberinto de la Soledad, The Labyrinth of Solitude, a psychocultural political exploration of the new mestizaje, the Latino culture in the United States that results from immigration to the North. And after that, it became a constant, voracious need to see where Paz was going next. He was also, in a major way, the publisher of a magazine, first Plural. That was the title of the journal. It was started as a supplement of one of the newspapers, Excelsior, and when he fought with the government because the government was trying to censor some of the content of Plural, he became independent and created another magazine called Vuelta, which could be translated as return or turnaround, that was used through Paz as the organ through which many European, African, American, Latin American writers were first introduced to Mexico. So if Paz himself was a lighthouse, Paz himself was also a compass and a map and a landing ground for many intellectuals and artists who paraded through Vuelta and were, as a result, first introduced to Mexico through those that influence of Paz, and with whom he created, in many ways, lasting relationships. In the case of the United States, I'm talking about Susan Sontag and Irving Howe and Lionel Trilling, among many others, and the names in each of the countries that where a major intellectual played a role are equally relevant. So a man who was not content simply on sitting and writing his poems, not content only in illuminating the heart and the mind through writing essays that were for a broad readership, who was not condescending in the way he used knowledge, and not even called attention to the vast cosmopolitan erudite knowledge that he had accumulated over the years, but in the Renaissance way, believed that there are no such thing as disciplines, that science and the humanities are married and will never truly be separated, and that the business of seeing anthropology and psychology and sociology and history as separate is an invention of the university and not a reality of the true and lasting world. A man who became himself a translator from Chinese and from Indian cultures, who was fascinated by poets of indigenous ancestries and adapted them into the Spanish language. I'll wrap up by saying it is thanks to Paz that Spanish, el español, is now much more broad, much more universal, a language that not only belongs to Spanish speakers, but belongs to everybody else in the world, and that doesn't have to be a banner of pride. It can be a point of encounter of the many solitudes that we have, each in and around their own culture, and those solitudes can be shared, can be articulated, can become platforms to leave a mark of who we are in this world, as Octavio Paz so illustriously did. Piero, back to you.
Thank you. This was a very, very good summary. Okay, I have a question about language. I have a question about progress. But first, I want to make sure we say something about my two favorite poetic works by Paz. I also discovered him originally as a poet. So Piedra de Sol, Sandstone, and Blanco. Can you say a few words about them? Piedra de Sol, Sandstone is one of those works that if you ask 100 people, what is it about? You get 100 different answers. And it's 585 lines. Maybe you can tell us what this number means. And Blanco is also another strangely structured poem.
Yeah. Let me start with Piedra de Sol. For our viewers, for the readers of the book, it's important to remember that it is a reference to the Aztec imagery of the sun stone. The Aztecs had a cosmovision that rotated around the sun and the moon and built their pyramids around them. It was when Octavio Paz had traveled through Oaxaca and through Yucatan, Quintana Roo, the Yucatan Peninsula, that and then returned to Mexico City, that he discovered the way that Aztec culture and Nahuatl language accounted for a devotion to the polarities between lightness and darkness, between good and evil, between up and down. And his attempt in Piedra del Sol was to use summarily, so succinctly, an exploration through time and space of a Mexico as perceived by him that connected to the period of the Aztecs as it mutated to the present time. It's an astonishing work, and it is an astonishing statement of the philosophy that Octavio Paz had, that to be a Mexican poet today, you are required to connect with the past. And yet, the Aztecs didn't have a vision of the past as something behind us and the future as something ahead of us. They had a vision of time as cyclical, always marked by a set number of days, a set number of cycles, and the 532 or 235 were marked days in the calendar of the Aztecs that would, when finished, create a cataclysm that would bring back elements that had just concluded into starting a new cycle. He, in his poetry, wants to create an atemporal poetry that emerges from the present, but looks to erase the artificial Western view of how we perceive time, as progressive, as going from, in an arrow form, from the ancestral, the antiquity to the future, to the recognition that right now, as you and I are speaking, Piero, Hernan Cortés is arriving to the city of Tenochtitlan, where he is encountering for the very first time the Aztec monarch Moctezuma and eventually his successor, Cuauhtémoc, in that you and I, in 100 years, will also be having this conversation, as somebody else will be exploring the cycles of time. So that is for Piedra de Toque or Piedra del Sol. And then Blanco is, I should say that Octavio Paz is fascinated with colors. There are many colors that permeate his poetry, and the color white. Let me bring this to the center. One of the discoveries that Octavio Paz makes when he is in India is of the symmetry between the polytheistic culture of India and the polytheistic culture of the indigenous past in Mexico. He believes that those two countries are intricately connected, even though they are so far apart from one another. In 1968, he writes an essay about India, and at the very end of his life, he writes a gorgeous book about India again, many years later, going back to the imagery. But he establishes this, Piero, as a maybe Robert Louis Stevenson would, with the argument that there's no such thing as an outsider. All of us are outsiders. All of us arrive to a place where everybody in it is an outsider, discovering for the very first time colors and time and tastes. So the act and art of traveling for Paz is also the act and art of discovering his own country. He thinks about Mexico and writes about Mexico when he's thinking and writing about India, and vice versa. And the color white is the color that is absent to him in India, and it's the color that is he wants to stress in Mexico. It's a beautifully surrealistic poem that is very internal. It seems to be in a deep dialogue with himself, and it's about the eternal present present and the impressionistic view that he has of that solitude that enwraps him.
Thank you. Incidentally, when I talk about Sandstone, Piedra del Sol, I get people to tell me that it's about time, love, death, life, eternity, just about everything.
Good.
Okay. Language. So Blanco takes me to language. One thing that amazes me about Octavio Paz is the language that he created. Maybe because he was blending history, mythology, and philosophy, and then he was a poet, and maybe he was just a gifted genius. And by the way, I think I can't think of anybody else who has been so good uh, at blending the poetic and the analytic, the
Sure.
same person, right? So anyway,
Yeah.
you want to tell us something about his language, and yeah,
Sure.
the best, of course, is just to read him. But can you
Yeah.
say something about what?
I want to catch just one line that you just said before I delve into this wonderful question of yours. Blending the poetic with the analytic. He does it in an utterly admirable way. I think he is a devoted and devout reader of Eliot, who is also a sharp literary critic and essayist, T.S. Eliot, and a superb, supreme poet, and with the other Latin American giant that is a contemporary of Paz, a slightly older Jorge Luis Borges from Argentina, who wanted to be remembered as a poet, one of the best sonnet writers of the Spanish language, with which itself has an admirable history of sonnet writers, but who wrote essays and short stories in a clearly analytical way. And it's just as in the case of Paz, extraordinary to see how the poetry can be analytical, but can also defy analysis, and how his essays can be very poetic. And yet be shrewd and be surgical in the way they analyze a particular topic. The language of Octavio Paz, that in and of itself, Piero, is a topic where I could spend many hours. I wonder sometimes to myself how vast his vocabulary it might have been in numbers. How many words did Octavio Paz actually use in his entire oeuvre? There is no such count that I know of. And not that it would tell me something that I don't know, but simply because I'm a passionate lover of dictionaries, and because he wrote often about dictionaries himself, the Dictionary of the Royal Academy and the Diccionario de Autoridades, he talks about the span, the arc of Sor Juana's language. And just as he did that, I wonder how vast a vocabulary it is as he swallows words from the French and from the Hindu and from the English and Portuguese and Chinese and incorporates them into the Spanish language. But the aspect that one is struck by in Paz is that it feels effortless. The essays feel as if he is not belaboring the process of writing, but that it is an automatic writing that is coming out. I think he uses himself that term. He steals it from surrealism. Surrealists believe that the best type of writing is the one that bypasses reason and goes directly into this instinct or the subconscious where things come out unimpededly. And I think in Octavio Paz, one has the impression of a flux of his language that is unimpeded. I have seen many of his manuscripts. He corrected very little, meaning that in most cases, the very first version is the final version with just slight emendations. It is impromptu. It has a jazzy quality to it, and yet it is very well formed. And all this makes me wonder, and I wonder this about myself too, what kind of translation process is taking place in Paz, not from one language to another, but from thought into writing. The translation of ideas that are coalescing in his mind and then are mapping themselves on the page in a way that feels as if it is exactly where they belong. One has the impression with Paz, not always, but often, as one does with Borges, that if one took one of his canonical texts, shook it, and let the words go into the air and descend again on the page, they would fall exactly in the same place where he located them. That was the place where they were born to be in. That is the impression that one has with Paz, that these pieces, the Labyrinth of Solitude, Blanco, Piedra de Toque, some of the sections of the biography of Sor Juana, that you wouldn't change a word. The words are where they should be. The words were born to be in that location.
Wonderful. Maybe if we have
Maybe
time.
let me just add one more. He in his youth he had lived in Paris and was infatuated with French culture, Mallarmé, in particular Baudelaire. He translated poems of the 19th century into Spanish. And just as in the case of Borges, one feels that Borges is thinking in English, but writing in Spanish. In the case of Paz, one often thinks, at least those of us who are native, that he has a francophone sensibility or way of thinking that is coming out effortlessly in the Spanish language.
Yeah, very interesting. Yeah, that's this whole thing of the is a cosmopolitan life would be another long discussion.
Yeah,
Uh, since the lasers are also about science and technology, and we mostly have speakers in science technology, and we live in the age where there's this ideology of progress. I don't think Paz wrote specifically about progress, but he mentioned it, right, several times.
absolutely. And he
So I
was
would
very
like,
interested in recent scientific and technological developments. He was interested in astronomy and in the world of medicine. They get filtered into his essays of the 80s and 90s. He is very much aware of the changing world that is defining him. He acknowledges the fact that he's living in Mexico, a country where science comes from the outside, where technology is imported rather than exported, and meditates on what it means to live in a culture that is receiving those elements from the outside. And to counterbalance that, he says Mexico is a country that gives poetry to the world, just as it receives science and technology, and gives mythology to the world as well. So it's not as if we live in an inferior position. It's just that each civilization has its strengths.
yeah. So yeah, so the ideology of progress has been driving humankind for at least 2 centuries, and not only the West. In fact, today, for a number of reasons, I travel a lot to Asia. I think people believe, people in China and India believe in progress more than we do. I mean, there's less criticism in a sense. So it has been, and so it's interesting if you can say a few words about his view of progress, which I find particularly relevant and current in the age, where we start talking about artificial intelligence. We have machines we already have machines everywhere, and there's a society that tries to turn us into machines. So he's no
Yeah.
longer here, but what he said back then, I find could be very interesting even today.
As in the case of anybody who is no longer here, it is the duty, the task of the living to interpret those that are gone. My suspicion, well, first I would say Paz did not believe in progress as a linear force that moves toward a utopian future where there's a harmony that is about equality and justice and about the betterment of human lives altogether. Because he was a child of Mexico, and because particularly of his deep interest in pre-Columbian, mostly Aztec and Mayan cultures, he believed in the cyclical nature of time. He did not believe that we would reach a moment where we would be able to shake off elements that are grounding us, that are anchoring us. He instead believed that the progress is a mirage, is a temporary distraction, and that there are bigger, more important absolute truths that define us from the moment of birth as civilizations and individuals to the moment of death, and that we should be cautious in not misunderstanding the fallacy or the truism that is really a fallacy of technology and science, where thought can be given to us by machines, that governments can decide for us what is good and what is wrong. He was an absolute individualist in the sense that he recognized that the best way to live life was to understand inside us what is the correct way and what is the incorrect way, what is good and what is bad, and that we only live with the elements that we have in the present as a way to alleviate the ills of that solitude, but never fully to overcome it. Any sense that it's that media, that it's that spectacle offered by technology that will make us forget our solitude is false and dangerous.
Okay, we have 3 questions from Arun. Arun, you want to ask the questions directly? I don't know if
Can you
Arun.
hear me?
Yes,
Yeah.
I can hear. Speak loud a little bit.
Okay, so we'll start with the shorter ones and go to the longer ones. The short ones are following our progress. Did Paz have any views about dystopian or utopian futures that he talked about besides the cyclical time?
He wasn't, unlike other Latin American writers of the period. Again, Borges is one, another one is Mario Vargas Llosa from Peru, and Gabriel Garcia Marquez from Colombia. He often read and commented on utopia and dystopia, but did not write a dystopian poem or short story or an opera or a utopian one. The topics themselves did not prompt enough of an inspiration to him, though he was very interested in the idea of how to reach a moment of equanimity and harmony between the environment and ourselves. And as I was saying, Aaron, he was cautious and skeptical of the promises of technology and science as resolving our day-to-day dilemmas.
And you mentioned his thinking and the mapping of thoughts to words being very precise. Do you think he was thinking like in a visual space, in a social space? Like, what do you think the representations in his mind actually were before they got
I,
mapped out into
I
language?
love that question. I love that question. I think that Paz is I think that Paz is in many ways in his poetry a visual poet, but I don't think his mind works through visuals, but through sounds, echoes, music, rhythm, patterns of language. I get the impression when I'm reading his poems that it is the cadence, the harmony or disharmony of words, the structure of those sentences that is prompting him to the next thought, and not the image that he is invoking. Though when one reads Blanco, or when one reads many of his poems, one gets the impression that one, for instance, is entering an Aztec temple and sees the various elements of it, the rocks, the serpents, the birds, but very quickly he forgets about developing those images and lets us hear how the word pájaro, bird, or pyramid might provoke another word. I think rather than visual, his mind works through sounds.
Wonderful. Yeah, that's super unusual. Um, the next question I had was, I know when he passed away, a lot of people thought of him as like a kind of a rightist sort of writer in some ways, even though his work kind of seems to span the spectrum of just being non-dogmatic. Some views seem very left, some very right, some are all over the place. One of the odder ones I saw was this his defense of Spanish and Portuguese colonialism, or at least trying to
Right.
balance out all the negatives that people talk about with the positive gains. Like, what do you make of that? How was it received? I mean, it's a very
Yeah,
controversial, view, especially today, even 20 years
of
after,
course.
25 years
Yeah,
after. So
excellent question, Aaron. Um, I, I I can speak now with the benefit of seeing his life in toto, complete, from 1914 to 1998, which is truly a benefit, because if you looked at Octavio Paz when he wrote The Labyrinth of Solitude, he was of a particular ideological persuasion that changed this is in 1950, that changed in 1968, that changed again at the end of the 70s, and that continued to mutate. Today, in retrospect, or seen as an arc, it would be easy, certainly for me, to say that he spans the entire gamut of ideological moments in a way in Latin America, from starting very lefty to ending very righty. Some of the writers of his generation remained on the left. Pablo Neruda was a lefty at the beginning and remained even more lefty, even a Stalinist at the end of his life. Julio Cortázar from Argentina started on the kind of right, conservative, and then moved to the left. Maybe the other Latin American writer that also had a similar journey is Mario Vargas Llosa, also a Nobel Prize winner in 2010, who, just like Paz, had been an ardent supporter of the Cuban Revolution before it became dogmatic. So in 1957-58, when Fidel Castro came to Havana, all of them celebrated that arrival as a new moment in Latin America. And Octavio Paz was a big celebrant like others, but very quickly he soured on the realization that the Havana regime was already imprisoning its dissidents. And by the time Margaret Thatcher was prime minister in England, he himself had become a Thatcherite in the 80s. So he had gone from being a communist, like Neruda, to being a right winger. And that is why when he won the Nobel Prize in 1990, there was a huge portion of Mexicans who felt that he no longer spoke to them, particularly the young, as a true voice of the complexity of Mexican reality, that he had sold his soul to the devil, that he had become too complacent. He didn't say what I'm about to say, but there is a Mexican president, and you've heard this from others in other parts of the world, that Octavio Paz knew very well. This Mexican president said once that if you, when you're young, are not a socialist or a communist, you don't have a soul. But if you remain a socialist or a communist when you are in your 70s or your 80s, you're a fool. And Octavio Paz, not in those words, probably could have said exactly the same. And if he didn't, then he certainly exemplified it. He had become much more conservative. Now, is that the pattern of life in general? Myself at 64, not being exactly the ardent revolutionary that I was when I was a young man? Maybe, but others take the opposite direction.
Great. Yeah, and I think even going farther to the defense of colonialism, I think is a very, intense, interesting view and his articulation of it. The final question I just had was, what modern living writers do you think have that range and polymathic ability of Paz? Does he have any descendants or people who have continued the torch, anywhere in the world, not just in the Latin countries?
I love those questions, Aaron, really, truly. Um, let me just very quickly start by telling you that at the time of Paz, with Vuelta and Plural, there were spaces where one could meditate intellectually without the obligation of reducing everything to 172 words, without the instant satisfaction that you would have 2,000 people that would befriend you because you said something that pleased them just for that very second and then disappeared. The culture of instant gratification has destroyed the patterns of engaged intellectual reflection. And one of the fears that I have is that if there are such sensibilities, the environment that we have created intellectually is no longer conducive unless you isolate yourself behind the academic walls to reflect thoroughly and especially to a larger audience on topics that are urgent and essential to all of us. Having said that, there are a number of international writers. In Mexico, there is a wonderful essayist and novelist, Juan Villoro, who can write superb essays, very impressionistic too. He would call himself a child of an intellectual a brainchild of Octavio Paz. There are writers in Israel, writers in France, in Argentina, that have that tenor and breadth. The challenge is to find the forums or to be able to read them, have the patience and the endurance to read them in a sustained fashion. And that is the fear that I have, that we have lost that capacity to retain the attention span for deep, complex thought.
Yeah, deep thinking. Um, very interesting conversation, of course. I just want to remind everybody, Octavio Paz was born, as you said, in the middle of the Mexican Revolution. That was just before World War One.
Right.
So he probably grew up with hearing of the trauma of World War one of the worst massacres in the history of our species. Then he experienced the Spanish Civil War, which was another massacre. Then World War II, and then the various wars of the Cold War, right? Korean War, Vietnam War. They didn't affect Mexico directly, but as we said, Octavio Paz was a globetrotter. He was a cosmopolitan. So he wrote, unfortunately, I don't remember where, but he wrote, our century has been terrible, but the real tragedy is inside us.
Sure.
And so I wonder if that's where
Yeah.
the obsession with solitude comes from.
Yeah, keep in mind, that this is a region in Mexico that even before the arrival of the Spaniards, had already been in deep war between the different indigenous factions. The Aztecs were a colonial empire that would devour in cannibalistic ways too. The Aztecs believed in cannibalism, particularly as a way to conquer fully and destroy slaves. And when the arrival of the Spaniards in 1522, 23, and the bringing down of Tenochtitlan as the capital city, from epidemics, from war, the number of people that died in Mexico is astonishingly large. Sometimes it is said that 3 out of every 5 Aztecs that were alive prior to the arrival of the Spaniards did not make it to within a few years. I would say that arguably, the Spanish Civil War, the Cuban Revolution, and the fall of the Soviet Union were the three major ideological moments for Paz. Of course, the Second World War, of course, the Mexican Revolution, and the First World War. But ideologically, what he witnessed, the clash between the fascists and the Republicans, and the conviction that you needed to volunteer in a country that was in the middle of a civil war, because that civil war, like Ukraine today, is not only the war of Ukraine and Russia, but it's the war between larger factions of the world that many, Arthur Koestler and Hemingway and Neruda and Vallejo and Paz, all descended there to be part, or at least witnesses, of what that Spanish Civil War was. The fall of the whole Soviet structure was, Latin America was in the middle of the Cold War, was seen as a peon between the United States and Russia, and the fall of the Soviet bloc brought along neoliberalism to Latin America, an aspect that, on the one hand, Paz embraced, and on the other, he quickly became disenchanted with the fast speed of the open market economy, thinking it was erasing Mexican individuality and authenticity and was turning them into merchandise. So these are turning points that are decisive. You know, I can tell you, and I wrote an essay about this, as a Mexican Jew, for me, the Holocaust would have been a very significant moment. And yet Octavio Paz, because his interest lied elsewhere, hardly speaks about the Holocaust. He speaks about the Gulag. He speaks about Solzhenitsyn. He speaks about individualism in the face of a ogre that is the all-encompassing state and the role of freedom. So we all choose in the epoch that we live in what are the torches that we're going to carry with ourselves, and we all use those torches to light inside us that solitude that we have and articulate it in different ways. I used to react negatively to certain choices that Paz made, but again, at 64, I've done the same. And it's inevitable that you can't digest everything that is around you, even though we're in the culture of voraciousness where we think we can encompass everything.
Fantastic. We kept you for more than 1 hour. I apologize.
No apologies in this case. We're looking, your audience, you and many of us, for spaces to be able to reflect in sustained fashion. And I thank you and all those who heard us today and all those who will hear us tomorrow. Hopefully there's a spark there that will have an echo and carry on.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.